The palace of Bourbon Parma woke in silence. Morning light crept through the curtains, a pale blue breath that barely touched the marble floors. The corridors were motionless, the clocks frozen at the 12th second, as if time itself had refused to move for her. In the upper chamber, Princess Maria Theresa of Bourbon Parma sat by the window, wrapped in the thin air of dawn. The garden below shimmered with dew, and the fountains whispered without sound. She watched them not for beauty, but for proof that something outside her still existed. Every morning she counted her breaths until the weight in her chest loosened. Breathing had become her ritual, the small rebellion she could still command. To the servants, she was fragile. To the courtiers, she was distant. To the physicians, she was melancholic. Yet her silence was not weakness. It was a shield, a discipline, a way to survive the noise of a world that never stopped demanding her perfection. They called her reserved, but behind that stillness was exhaustion. Each movement of the court, each expectation wrapped in silk, pressed against her lungs until she could no longer speak. In her quiet there was resistance, a hidden strength that no one cared to understand. The empire wanted a spectacle. She gave them nothing but calm. As the first light touched her face, it filtered through the thin veil of the curtains and fell upon her hands. She did not move. She did not speak. She only breathed, softly enough not to disturb the morning. If silence could be a form of survival, perhaps her story will show you why. Stay until the end, and subscribe to our channel, where the quietest souls of history finally find their voice. In the palace of Bourbon Parma, childhood was never gentle. Every step echoed like an inspection, every gesture rehearsed beneath the eyes of discipline. From the moment Princess Maria Theresa of Bourbon Parma could stand, her life became a lesson in stillness. Tutors corrected her walk, her smile, the tilt of her chin. Breathing itself was measured, as if the air she took belonged to the crown. In that world of formality, fear was not taught. It was absorbed. It filled the silence between her mother's words and the polished floors that reflected her trembling hands. Her mother's voice carried through the corridors, calm yet sharp, reminding her never to shame the family. Those words pierced deeper than any reprimand. They stitched themselves into the fabric of her thoughts, until even the sound of laughter felt dangerous. Maria began to count to calm herself. First steps, then breaths, and later, the stitches on her dress. She would run her fingers along the hem, tracing each thread until her heartbeat slowed. It was her secret ritual, a discipline that no governess could detect. To everyone else, she was composed. Only she knew it was fear disguised as grace. At lessons, she spoke softly, her voice fading whenever a door opened. She memorized her prayers but never dared to say them aloud. When her father's ministers passed through the halls, she would lower her gaze until their footsteps disappeared. The palace trained her to be invisible, to perfect obedience until it looked like serenity. Inside, she longed to move freely, yet even the thought of freedom made her chest tighten. At night, she sat beside the window, watching the lamps in the courtyard flicker against the fog. She avoided the mirrors. The reflection frightened her, not because of what she saw, but because she did not recognize the girl looking back. Sometimes the oil light cast two shadows on the wall, one of a child and one of a stranger who watched her from within. That was how she learned that fear had a face of its own. Years would pass before she understood that silence had become her native language. It was her shield, her classroom, and her inheritance. While other children learned music and dance, Maria learned how to breathe without being heard. In her stillness, she carried the legacy of a family obsessed with perfection. A family that never realized its finest creation was breaking quietly before their eyes. Fear had become her tutor, and silence her native tongue. When Maria Theresa of Bourbon Parma reached her youth, the palace decided that she must be seen. The world expected her to sparkle among chandeliers and polished marble. The first invitation to the royal ball arrived wrapped in gold ribbon, but to her it felt like a summons. On the evening of the event, the halls blazed with candlelight, their reflections scattering across mirrors and gilded walls, until the air itself seemed alive with scrutiny. Every glance was an evaluation, every whisper a blade. The music began, soft at first, then louder as violins climbed into brightness. Around her, dresses swirled, fans fluttered, voices laughed. She stood at the edge of the ballroom, breath shallow, hands folded to hide their trembling. Her chest tightened as if an invisible thread pulled her ribs together. The room moved too quickly, the colors too bright, the laughter too sharp. She felt her pulse pounding in her ears until it drowned the rhythm of the orchestra. A court physician once said she suffered from nerves, a polite way of explaining what no one understood. In truth, she was drowning in a fear that had no name, a fear that wrapped itself around every movement, every smile demanded by etiquette. Her body obeyed the rules of grace while her mind screamed for escape. The more they praised her composure, the deeper she fell into quiet panic. When the music swelled again, she slipped away through a side corridor. Her heels barely touched the floor as she fled the brightness for the calm of the library. Inside, dust floated in the light like falling snow. Shelves towered over her, full of voices that asked nothing in return. She reached for a book of old philosophy and opened it with hands still shaking. The words of Marcus Aurelius stared back at her, steady and unafraid. She traced a line with her finger and whispered it to herself. If the mind can be its own master, then perhaps I can be free. The phrase stayed with her, echoing longer than the music she had left behind. In that moment, the library became her refuge, the only place where she could breathe without performing. Stoic wisdom offered her a rope to hold onto, not to climb out, but to stop from sinking further. When she finally closed the book, the candles outside had burned low, and the echoes of the ballroom had faded into the distance, leaving only the sound of her breath returning to its rhythm. When the Bourbon Parma court announced her betrothal, the halls filled with relief. The alliance with an Italian prince would restore what years of quiet scandal had eroded. The engagement was not a matter of affection, but of necessity. In every conversation, Maria Theresa of Bourbon Parma heard the same phrase repeated with calm precision: "This marriage will save us." For months, she was prepared like an offering. Dressmakers arrived from Milan, priests rehearsed the vows, and musicians practiced the march she would walk to. She nodded through every fitting, through every blessing, trying to believe that obedience was still a form of grace. But as the day approached, her old fear returned. Each whisper about the ceremony felt heavier than the silk around her shoulders. At night, she dreamed of faces turning toward her, of hands reaching to adjust, to judge, to correct. On the morning of the wedding, she woke before the bells. The gown hung beside the bed, pale and luminous in the dawn. When the maids entered, she tried to rise, but the air had grown too thin to breathe. Her pulse raced, her fingers went cold, and the world blurred to white. Every sound became distant, She felt the weight of the dress without touching it, the pearls pressing against her throat, the walls closing around her. It was not nerves, it was terror. Her body refused to obey the ritual of being seen. By midday, the palace understood. The ceremony could not proceed. The Italian envoys were informed that the princess had fallen ill. Within hours, her cousin was chosen as substitute bride. The alliance was saved, and the court erased her name from the announcements. No one spoke of what had happened. The physicians wrote of exhaustion. The priests spoke of divine testing, but the truth remained behind a locked door. That evening, the dress was left hanging in her chamber. Light from the setting sun filtered through the lace, turning the dust into drifting ash. Maria sat nearby, her eyes unfocused, the silence heavy around her. From that day forward, the servants called her the Still One. Her illness was never of the body. It was born of the dynasty itself, a sickness inherited through generations of watching and being watched. The Bourbons had built their peace upon performance, and now their most delicate air had suffocated beneath it. In Maria's quiet collapse lay the reflection of her entire house. A kingdom obsessed with appearance had finally witnessed the cost of its own perfection. The years softened her name into a whisper. Maria Theresa of Bourbon Parma no longer appeared at gatherings, no longer stood beside her mother in portraits or processions. Her world had shrunk to a single wing of the palace where silence ruled without rival. The clocks there had stopped long ago, their hands pointing endlessly toward the same forgotten hour. No one remembered who ordered them to remain unwound. Some said it was her request. Others said they simply obeyed her stillness. She lived among small rituals. In the mornings, she tended a garden of dry flowers, fragile stems that refused to bloom yet refused to die. She taught one of the younger maids to read, tracing words in dust on the wooden table when paper felt too formal. The girl called her gentle, but there was precision in every movement, a quiet discipline that made even kindness seem rehearsed. At dusk, she lit candles one by one, always the same number, always in the same order. Then she arranged the objects on her writing desk to face north and south, as if the geometry of the world could keep her from unraveling. She wrote letters that no one would receive, some to the prince she never married, others to her father, and some to herself. When the ink dried, she folded the pages and placed them in a small wooden box. By now the box was full, heavy with unsent words. The physicians called her condition lingering melancholy. But what lived inside her was something different. It was not the sadness of loss, but the discipline of endurance. She had built within that room a miniature empire, a kingdom of order that no storm could touch. Every breath measured, every candle placed with purpose, every silence perfectly maintained. The chaos of the world was kept outside her walls, while inside she ruled the only thing left to her: control. One winter evening, the thunder of distant cannon reached the city. The war that her marriage was meant to prevent had finally come. Servants spoke of smoke on the horizon, of horses and banners and panic. She listened but did not move. The sound rolled through the palace like a slow tide and faded again. The world still moved, even without her. When the last candle burned low, she sat watching its reflection in the window glass. Beyond the frost, she saw nothing but her own calm face staring back, framed by shadows and light. The stillness was no longer a symptom. It had become her reign. Silence had become her empire, and no one dared to enter. Winter came quietly to the palace of Bourbon Parma. The corridors that once carried the sounds of ceremony now held only the slow footsteps of servants and the faint echo of distant bells. Maria Theresa of Bourbon Parma lay in her chamber, her body frail, her breath thin and uneven. Outside, snow drifted through the air like falling dust, settling on the frozen garden she had once tended with patient hands. Time had long since abandoned her room. The clocks remained still, their faces pale in the candlelight, frozen in eternal obedience. She spoke little now. The days passed in silence, marked only by the faint rustle of pages as she turned through her old letters. Her handwriting, once steady and small, had grown weak, the ink fading like her pulse. The maids brought warm cloths and whispered prayers, yet she seemed far away, as if listening to something no one else could hear. On her final morning, the light outside was thin and cold. She asked for the window to be opened. The servants hesitated, afraid of the winter air that could steal what little warmth remained in her body. But her voice, so soft and steady, left them no choice. Let it in. I must know if the world still breathes. The words lingered in the air like a farewell. They pulled back the curtains, and the dawn entered, slow and silver, crossing the floor until it reached her bed. For a moment, she looked toward the light, as if recognizing an old companion. The breeze lifted the edge of the curtain and touched her face. The candle beside her flickered once, then went out. When the servants returned, the room was silent. She no longer struggled for air. Her eyes were closed, and the faintest trace of a smile rested upon her lips. The morning light had covered her completely, soft and unbroken. Those who saw her said she looked untouched by death, as if she had simply dissolved into the light she had waited for all her life. The silence around her was not empty, but full, alive with the gentleness of release. In that final moment, fear had vanished, leaving only stillness, the kind that no longer hides but belongs. Her death was not an ending, but a return. The breath that once trembled in darkness had found its way back to the morning. The circle had closed, from the first light behind the curtain to the last. She did not escape silence. She became it. Years passed, and the palace of Bourbon Parma became a relic of another age. The halls that had once carried the weight of royal footsteps turned into corridors for visitors who came seeking the ghosts of history. The wars were long over, the bloodlines scattered, and the air of ceremony had turned into dust. Yet deep within the eastern wing, behind a locked wooden door, there remained a chamber that had not been touched since the death of Princess Maria Theresa of Bourbon Parma. When the door was finally opened, the air inside felt untouched by time. The curtains still hung heavy with the color of faded blue, and the faint smell of wax lingered in the cold. There were no mirrors on the walls and no portraits to tell who had lived there. Only a single clock stood on the mantel, its hands fixed forever at the 12th second, the same moment when time had abandoned her. On the writing desk lay a small, leather-bound notebook, its cover cracked but still intact. A visitor leaned close and read the last line written in her delicate hand. "Silence is not absence. It is the only language that does not lie." Those words echoed through the empty room like a soft pulse. They spoke not of despair, but of mastery. A final declaration from a woman who had been forced to live inside the gaze of others. Her silence had not been surrender. It had been refusal. Refusal to perform, to pretend, to bend her truth into something the world would applaud. In a court obsessed with appearance, she had chosen the invisible. In a dynasty built on spectacle, She had become its quiet rebellion. The notebook was placed in a glass case, and the room became a small memorial. Visitors walked through with careful steps, lowering their voices without knowing why. Light filtered through the same curtain that had once softened her mornings. It moved across the room as the sun rose, touching the desk, the clock, the chair by the window. The air seemed to breathe again. The silence of Maria Theresa was not failure. It was a form of wisdom that outlived her. Where others sought power through words, she found truth in its absence. In death, she had achieved what eluded her in life, a peace unbroken by judgment, a harmony beyond the reach of sound. As the light deepened to gold, it illuminated the room like the breath she once measured each morning. The past and the present folded into one still moment. The palace no longer spoke, yet it was far from empty. If her silence still breathes within these walls, subscribe to our channel, where history's quietest voices are finally heard.